Hi, my name is Janice Palaganis. I'm the Associate Director for Health Professions Education at MGH Institute of Health Professions. And you can say that I've taken a bit of interest in inclusivity and cultural considerations in health professions education based on my past personal experience that I enter this space with. I've been pretty lucky to be part of a few teams studying cultural factors that exist in education. And so first I'd like to thank my research team, Matt Charnetsky, adjunct faculty, Sharon Dow, master's student, Amanda Tarbett, librarian at MGH-IHP, have been studying with me cultural considerations in interprofessional education. Amanda and I have also been studying with Albert Chen from Hong Kong and Kim Layden from Qatar, cultural considerations in learning conversations, of which the findings of our work I'll be sharing with you today in this video. Um, so in a minute, I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and if you could just mentally think about your answers to these questions. Here is the situation. So here are my students. They all look different. They all talk differently. They all laugh differently. They all think differently. This is me walking in to run a small group learning conversation with my students. So here's where I'm going to ask you to think about answers to these questions. Number one, do you think cultural factors will be at play in this learning conversation? Number two, what do you see that makes you think that? Number three, if we were all white, would cultural factors be at play? I'm thinking that this is a clear yes, because I think we do need to understand that there is a difference between race and culture. It's very, very natural for us to judge a book by its cover, and very important to be aware that we naturally do that. So here's the last question that might be a little trickier. Where do you see cultural factors at play? For example, do you see it within me? Do you see it in the whole room? Do you see it between me and the students? Where do you see this? So we did a systematic review of the literature to understand this. And what I'd like to do, rather than spending time around the details of our systematic reviews, to give you a very brief summary and then focus on our findings. So for those of you that aren't aware of what a systematic review is, it is essentially that, a review of the literature, vast literature, to systematically screen it and then systematically analyze it from the perspective of your research question. Our research question was looking at debriefings, so the learning conversation that takes place after a clinical or simulated experience. We performed three independent searches of the databases available and appropriate to us, as well as journals where this topic would be published. And of course, the references from the articles that we found, they call that ancestry searching. So we found about 178 articles that met our screening criteria, which was peer reviewed and focused on healthcare debriefings and global cultural considerations. We found three articles out of the 178 that met the criteria. And so what I'll be presenting is the findings that we found. So while this is interesting, there were some inadvertent findings that added an interesting flavor to our work. A few we didn't expect, and yet the few that we were excited to find. So I'm going to share those three inadvertent findings with you. The first was that we recognized as we were screening that every well-published learning conversational model, including debriefing models, not limited to the English language, um, So we looked at all of these different well-published conversational models, and of 16, only 2 were not from North America. We also inadvertently realized that most educators who teach how to manage learning conversations or debriefings were either trained or self-trained by North American educators through courses of conference sessions. And by North Americans, I mean the United States and Canada. So I suspect that this finding, inadvertent finding, applies beyond our focus of debriefing into many, many courses that we teach today. This is a problem because I think the very way we know how to teach the models published and for most of what we teach, likely it comes from one area, one region, and in this case, North American philosophy. So it really prompted us to reflect on every single thing that we teach, the findings, the theory, the people who said it is a good way to teach it. Did they take into account other cultures? Do we need to change the way we teach? So, um, for example, in learning conversations, particular to debriefing, the way all models begin is by first conducting a reactions phase, getting a sense of the learner's emotions and perspectives on performance or experience. In cultures where there is hierarchy in the literature, this is referred to as power distance. It might actually not be effective to start there, but we haven't fully studied it. Of the 2 models that are not from North America, they came from Switzerland and Korea, and what we did find was that the progenitors of those models were trained by North American educators in courses. So, if anything, as educators, health professions educators, I beg you to reflect on what you know to be the best way to teach something. Is the philosophy, the research behind what you teach culturally tested? Don't just run with the ball. Make sure you examine the ball that you're using. The third most interesting finding, which was also serendipitous to our study, came from our discussion of all of the articles meshed with our personal experiences. And so I asked you earlier, where do you see cultural factors at play? And there are multiple aspects of cultural factors, each within its own synergy of combinations of multiple factors, 5 of which we were able to identify. Each individual learner in the conversation comes with their own story, their own cultural makeup. So we used the Matsumoto's definition of global culture. Culture can be anything. It might be global, it might be organizational, it might be generational, it might be professional, socioeconomic, or religious. In our studies, we referred to global culture as national or ethnic culture. And Matsumoto's definition is the set of attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by a group of people, but different for each individual, communicated from one generation to the next. And so when I say cultural makeup, I refer to what composes this set in this definition. So you have the individual, then the entire learner group has a combined cultural makeup. The educator has his or her their own cultural makeup. The organization in which the education occurs and as it relates to its natural culture has its own makeup. And then finally, the interactions, each social and feedback interaction contributes to a dynamic which could look like a sparring or a beautiful dance of different cultural makeup. And the reason creating conversational models that are culturally inclusive in every situation is complex is because your ethnicity does not predict sensitivity. The degrees of sensitivity for cultural offense, where one may be offended by an act or statement, differs within one global culture. So the complexity is that it is very personal. It is individual. And because of this, there's really no one size fits all. So your learning conversations will be different each time depending on who shows up at your table. So now I want you to think of your own education. And looking at the previous slide, I'll go back to it. Which aspect of cultural factors do you find the most challenging? Which aspect of the five listed here do you find most challenging? Perhaps you have more than what's listed here. Now, ask yourself, why is this challenging to you? And then finally, what is one thing that you can do to work on this? Because I do feel like we are all in a position for cultural shifts and shifts in understanding and framework around cultural considerations. So, given that a conversation is, uh, the complexity that happens in it as it relates to cultural considerations and learning conversations, it's um, very individual. There's no one size fits all when it comes to learning conversations. The question then becomes, well, what can we do? And we did find a few things that we can do to to create culturally respectful and inclusive learning conversations. Um, the first is to continually develop what Andy Malinsky calls global dexterity, or the ability to identify and adapt to cultural differences. And this is well published in the cultural intelligence literature if you're interested in learning more. The second is to challenge your cultural comforts while knowing your boundaries. Know what about yourself you'd be willing to change and what you're not willing to change, and push yourself to that point. Hopefully, continually pushing that point. And then engaging in future research. Qualitative and mixed methods are needed. Our findings in these studies urge us to better understand almost every facet of learning conversations as it relates to culture: who, what, when, where, why, and how. All of these three things ultimately lead to awareness. And in addition to the three things, awareness actually was it just remains to be our key tip. Awareness of the fact that the model you use or the way you were taught to teach might be culturally biased. Awareness that there are multiple aspects of cultural factors that exist in a conversation, and awareness as these three things describe. So, in terms of culturally sound and inclusive learning conversation methods or feedback methods, there is no one size fits all, but there is a one size respects all, and that really is in this word, awareness. Thank you.